Hello everyone, I hope everyone is safe and healthy. And in our previous lectures, we talked about how gender matters in all aspects of our social life. And in this video, we'll talk about the different theories and frameworks that attempts to explain the social construction of gender. So in this video, we will be talking about 4 gender frameworks: individualist, structuralist, interactionist, and institutionalist. So let's go and discuss first the individualist gender framework. So the individualist perspective on gender looks at person as someone who is essentially emanating a gender. So we talk about the gendered person. The individualist framework argues that gender is something that's inherent in a person. And it's more so something that emanates from a person rather than something that is nurtured by society. This framework argues that genders are traits, abilities, and psyches specific to males and specific to females. So every time we say that females are naturally intuitive and there's such a thing as maternal instinct, and every time that we say that males are naturally aggressive and they are naturally sexually impulsive, then we are thinking like an individualist. Because we attribute certain traits, certain psyche to males and females. We feel like these emotions, these traits, these abilities, these capacities are essentially emanating from a gender that's rooted to sex characteristics. Individualists argue that gender differences are also based on sexual dimorphism. It's based on biology and genetic factors that is related to male and female. So individualist frameworks kinds of supports the traditional views on gender roles or gender norms. Like for example, we assign hard labor to men because biologically they have larger musculature and they have bigger bone structure compared to females, and therefore more menial and more nurturing, caring jobs are attributed to women. And that when we look at the animal kingdom, the tendency of mammals, the female mammals, is to be the ones caring for the children, and the male counterpart of the mammals are the ones hunting for food. So we kind of transcended that biological basis of assigning roles from what we see in the animal kingdom. Also, the individualist framework of looking at gender supports the social learning approach towards developing gender-type behavior. This argues that children come to identify and endorse stereotypes related to gender because they are rewarded for gender-type behavior and or because they observe such behavior in the world around them. So again, first is they are rewarded for engaging in gender-type behavior. So for example, you are a boy and then you were rowdy in school or you got into sports and you get rewarded for that, then it's easier for you to think that that's the correct behavior that's attributed to males. Or if you're female and then you walk with finesse or you dress up nicely and you keep yourself pretty and you're rewarded for that as a kid, then you will socially learn that behavior is attributed to females and eventually you will embody that in yourself. And at the same time, social learning is related to gender identification, that the children are taught to follow their parents, their same-sex parents, as the role model of a certain gender. So female children or the daughters are asked to emanate the behaviors and attributes of their mothers, and the sons or the male siblings or the male children are asked to emanate or copy or mimic the behaviors and attributes of their fathers through gender identification. So both rewarding gender appropriate behavior with quote-unquote, and also identifying with the parent and other older siblings or older relatives and older significant others in terms of those who have the same sex with them, are both under the social learning approach, also under the individualist framework of looking at gender. Also, under the individualist framework is the theory of gender schema, which basically means that when children are growing up, they tend to align their gendered behavior with how the culture is teaching them, how to become males or females. Very much related to our discussions on agents of gender and cultural socialization. And of course, the first gateway to culture that they have is, of course, their family members, and then of course their immediate community, and then eventually their schools if they go to formal school. And then also there is a term we call gender polarization, which means that societies tend to define femininity and masculinity as polar opposite genders, such that male acceptable behaviors are not seen as appropriate for women and vice versa. And this is a very binary way of looking at feminine and masculine behaviors, male norms and female norms, which of course is kind of outdated, especially during these times na medyo progressive na tayo. So if you noticed the different ideas under the individualist gender framework, you would see that a lot of them are very traditional, a lot of them are very nuclear family-centered orientation in terms of the way they try to develop gendered ideas and gendered traits on their students. So it's very much based on both biology of the child or biology of the person being male or female. And it's also based on the psychological, the cognitive aspect of the child, such as you see it in the social learning approach and the gender schema theory. It's very cognitive. So what is different from individualists with the other three is that it doesn't dwell so much with the social gradients, but it really looks into individual differences and the individual development of how gender is, both on a biological and a psychological sense. The second gender framework, which elevates from an individual perspective of looking at how gender is developed to a more social, a more societal way of looking at how gender is understood and rationalized and justified, is the structuralist gender framework. So the structuralist gender framework argues that gender is actually a social structure. So when we say from a structural perspective of society, gender is something that is inherent in society that we have to align to, that we have to follow in order for us to have a stabilized society. So to keep our society in equilibrium, to keep our society stable and functional, we have to adhere to gender norms. Because structuralist gender frameworks justify that the gender norms, the traditional ones that we have, is actually working towards stabilizing and making our society functional. And that's the reason why, up until now, we have gender division of labor in different social institutions. So for example, if we look at the family, it is argued by structuralists that the nuclear family would be better off if we assign labor within the household based on gender. So the women and the female children will work on caretaking, doing household chores. And then the males in the family will be the ones who are going to be trained to do breadwinning, to look for work, and to bring home the money, make decisions, and also do hard labor or other related tasks. And they argue that this is important because these activities are complementary and must be assigned to different genders. So yun ang kanilang argumento bakit kailangan namin gender division of labor. And when you go to schools, parang ganun din ang nangyayari, di ba? For example, when you go to school, or you have to rearrange the chairs, the ones are going to carry the chairs will be the boys. The ones are going to be assigned to make the bulletin board is the females, because that act of creativity and aesthetics is something that is for females. And having this kind of division of labor makes the structure of schools better. It makes work faster according to structuralists. Ganon din sa work, no? You assign in an organization, you assign the hard labor and the leadership roles to males, and then you assign, customer service related work to females, like front desk receptionists, secretarial jobs, teachers, because these are nurturing jobs, nursing, because these are caretaking jobs, which are assigned to women. And according to the structuralists, of course, these are the older theorists on gender. According to them, again, dividing the labor that way makes society more well-oiled. It makes society more functional because we are tapping on the complementary traits of the women and men. And there is a function to society. And how do we know what are the labor that we have to assign to males and what are we assigning to females? Of course, for males, we assign what we call instrumental labor or instrumental functions. Like for example, doing hard labor, leadership roles, and decision-making roles. And for females, expressive. So it's really more improving the social bonds of the members of society. It's more on reproduction also, which is again outdated, but this is what they justify that for. And then also caretaking, nurturing roles, parenting roles, yan yung ibinigay sa mga females. And according to structuralists, this is how society will work better if we divide the labor this way. So the difference between the structuralists and the individualists is that the individualist comes from how does the individual get to know his or her gender norms. And the answer there is a biological basis for gender norms, and there is a psychological developmental basis for gender norms. For structuralists, in understanding of gender naman is gender exists because we need it. It's a structure that must be followed in society. So, structuralist. The third gender framework is the Interactionist Framework. So, this views gender as something that we do instead of something that is inherent or essential, or that's something that is part of the structure. It argues that we only have gender as a structure in a society because we perform a gender. Okay? So, interactionists are very much interested in looking at how we do gender. So, doing gender. So it argues that gender is a role and a status in society rather than an attribute that we essentially have, or rather as something that is natural in society that must be assigned to us. It is something that it is a role that we identify, it is a role that we perform, it is a status that we have in society. And interactionists argue that the more we perform a certain gender role, the more it becomes true, the more it becomes accepted. And if we do other forms of performance for a specific gender role, and because of habit, society agrees that it's something that's acceptable already for a certain gender, then it becomes part of the gender role. For example, many decades ago, women's roles, especially the mothers, they're supposed to be at home, being housewives, doing housework, taking care of their children, while their husbands are out, becoming economically productive, doing the breadwinning for the family. So that was the traditional role that were accepted to them. But just a few decades ago, there were more and more females who were entering the economic workforce. In the beginning, there was resistance in society. Because for so long a time, the ideal, woman or the ideal wife, the ideal mother is someone who stayed at home and cared for the children full time. Even in media, in drama series, teleseries, in films, usually they would, star the woman as the leading lady as the housewife, of a husband, or the happy ending is getting married to a husband and being a housewife in the end. That was the ideal woman during the time. But a few years ago, a few decades ago, the women started getting into the workforce, into the economic productive population. And as these women, interact more with the workforce, they start performing these roles in the economic landscape of the country, of the society. They started, solidifying, reconstructing their role as women as not just, people who are homemakers, but also possible contributors to organizations, public and private, and becoming good members of the economic workforce. And now, it's not anymore weird to see a woman or a mother who is also engaged in work, and not just doing homemaking or household work, because they started performing that role, and then many women started engaging in that role until they gain that status. They gain that status that women can actually be contributors to the economic workforce, and not just for homemaking. Interactionist theories also argues that our gender norms, we become more aware of it, and we perform them differently when we are with the same gender or with the quote-unquote opposite gender. I don't know if any of the males in this class went to an all-boys school, but when you look at the culture, inside an all-boys school, and the type of, masculinities that are being formed there, you would see it's quite different from a co-ed school, because in a boys' school, the masculinity, the misogyny, is kind of pampered there, because everywhere you go, you see men, you see males, you see other boys like you, and they perform manhood, and they reciprocate the manhood, they identify the manhood in the activities, actions, and the objects that they own. They reinforce each other's maleness. They reinforce each other's masculinity, and they don't see other forms of masculinity and other forms of gender expressions outside there. So, yung kanilang gender role at kanilang gender behaviors that is, being boys, is nagiging strengthened because of the people who they interact with. And then there's the term called tokenism. In current understanding, tokenism is the symbolic involvement of a person in an organization just because it's required. Like, for example, in this meeting or in this department, there's only there's only, all of us are male, so we have to also put a female inside, and that female is the token, just to say that this is a gender diverse workplace. So that's the current understanding of tokenism. But also, Cantor argues that the presence of a token or two makes dominants more aware of what they have in common. At the same time, it threatens that commonality, and therefore it defeats the purpose of being diverse in that specific department or in that specific group. Kasi ang tendency is that the males would eventually see how they're different from that single or two females in that meeting, and they would feel threatened about them, being in the meeting and having different ideals and different traits as they are, different roles as them, and will typically band together and, exert their dominance against females. And this can also happen vice versa, females and males, but it occurs more for males being more dominant. And I guess the threat comes from the fact that it gets uncomfortable because they can no longer do the usual masculine and misogynistic things that they could do, because there are already audiences who could be affected by their movement and thoughts and ideas, and therefore that's the reason why they can feel threatened. So yon, interactionist gender framework, specifically on tokenism. And then the fourth and final framework is the institutionalist framework, and argues that genders are not structures. Gender is not merely just something that we do, or gender is not something that's merely just developing something in us biologically and psychologically, but in society, gender is an institution. And when we say that something is an institution, it's something that we construct, something that we create, something that we merely just agree on. And usually, institutions, they favor the dominant, they favor the more powerful. And institutions are created because the powerful in society want to maintain their power and want to gatekeep, marginalized people from that power. And basically, institutions are established practices and rules of the games. And in terms of gender, they are rules in terms of how you should be in a society if you're a man or a woman. Gender institutions are self-perpetuating. This is something that we do almost unconsciously, and they almost take on a life of their own without really questioning them. Like, for example, in the Philippines, there's really no law that says that, males should be the ones, doing the first move in establishing a romantic relationship with a woman, and usually women are, despite them liking a guy, they usually, wait for the guy to approach them. They just throw hints but never really say that I like you. They usually wait for the guy because that's how society is. And that's something that we perpetuate from generation to generation, but it's not really part of a policy. It's not really part of the constitution or the law. It's just that, when we do against that, we will receive also negative sanctions. Probably it's not that very negatively sanctioned nowadays, but, a few years ago, usually females get questioned if they, be the ones who are forward enough to tell that they like a guy. So these are examples of, gendered practices, social practices that are super taken for granted. We just know that they're there, We just know that, a man has to open a door for a woman. It's not really a part of any law. It's not a formal law, it's not a formal norm, but it's something that we do. It's something that we reproduce, every day, something that we pass on from generation to generation. And if it's not done, we provide negative social sanctions to these people. And then, of course, it seeps through every social institution, family, communities, schools, workplaces, religion, government, diba? To the point that it's so well oiled, it's so established, that we think it's a function. But when you really look back way beyond the past that we can really remember, we know that these are things that humans only made up, and they just agreed upon this. Like, for example, marriage. Marriage really was supposed to be just an income, protective ceremony. It wasn't really about love. Marriage was done because families wanted to grow their economic estate. But now, because, many years, centuries after, the production or the invention of the term marriage, we already connote that with love, right? Another really weird institutional practice that we have developed very recently is the gender reveal parties. Like, again, it's not a requirement for you to do gender reveal parties, and at the same time, it's also socially abrasive, socially negative na kayo ay mag-practice ng gender reveal party, because again, you are assuming the gender of the child, assuming na iyon ay yung sex at birth niya, and also, when you say that, our child is a boy, and suddenly, it seems like a huge part of how he will be socialized is already planned out for him. Diba? Pag sinabi mong, our baby is a boy, and suddenly, almost automatically, your friends will buy the child, pants, the child will buy the child stuff that are blue, will buy the child with toys that are, that are related to boys, but we never really question that type of practice. Well, in fact, many years ago, pink was actually, assigned to males and blue were assigned to females. So these are, taken for granted notions and institutions that are not really, from the argument of the structuralist. Yeah, these discrepancies are complementary. These are needed for function. But when you look at historically, many centuries ago, it's something that they didn't do. They actually practiced otherwise, and they were still functional. So yun yung argument ng institutionalist, that genders are just institutions. These are just habits of society that we passed on from generation to generation, that we socially control as a society through formal and informal ways. And the bad part of having gendered institutions like this, is because they play a central role in gender distinctions and gender inequalities, and therefore the main institution that we follow as a gender institution is patriarchy. Patriarchy meaning we provide more leeways and opportunities to males and masculinities. Okay? They have more amassed power and opportunities in society. So that is how patriarchy is. And through this lens, we also see a lot of patriarchy and a lot of gender inequality and a lot of sexism, and a lot of misogyny seeping through other social practices. Like, for example, language. The use of the words, pardon me for using them, like slut, or bitch, or sissy, or bakla, used as degrading terms against women and against non-heterosexuals. These are all products of an institution. These are just habits that are formed by a society. Diba? How queer used to be a term that was used as a slur against gay people. It's just that, queer people reclaimed the word queer and say, no, this is something that we identify with and you can no longer use this to debase us. Diba? You can no longer use this to shame us. It also seeps into some of the basic ideologies that are harmful against women. Like, of course, we know rape culture, of how we perpetuate, victim blaming against the women who are harassed, who are raped, or worse, who are killed because a man wants to sexually dominate them, assert the power to them. This is also a work of the rape culture is something that's taken for granted. It's not even part of our constitution, but you can feel it. It's there. Diba? There are formal laws against rape, but how many rapists do we get to really catch and really litigate and prosecute? How many rapists are actually especially those who are powerful, who can really get away with it? And most of the negative consequences are faced by the victims. How many times will a rape victim come out in social media and point out a person as this person has harassed her, but this person is the one attacked, and the one who is accused of rape is the one being protected because the person is sikat or is a celebrity? How many times did we have issues of professors or bosses harassing students and workers and colleagues, but their cases do not see the light of getting sued, or it's getting dismissed? So yeah, and these are things that they're supposed to be illegal. These are laws that are supposed to be protecting women, but these experiences, these words are very palpable when we go to social media. of how women are blamed for what they wear and what they were doing, and that they were asking for it because of what they were wearing. Diba? So, yon. So, rape culture is also related to institutionalist gender framework. This this social practice of perpetuating victim blaming rape culture is something that is not even, it's an established practice. No, even though it's not formally put into our laws or policies. So aside from rape culture, another social practice that is perpetuated by the institution of patriarchy from a institutionalist framework is hegemonic, or what we know as toxic masculinity. And basically, these are the established practices and the rules that makes a man a real man. And what are the traits and roles and performances that are attributed to toxic masculinity or hegemonic masculinity of being a man? You know, there's violence and aggression. You know, you are a man if you are aggressive, you're violent, if you show emotional restraint, if you do not show your emotions, if you exude courage, toughness, if you have physical strength and athleticism, if you take risks, adventure and thrill seeking, competitiveness and achievement and success. So that is, just a set of traits that are related to, gender expression of masculinity of a real man that is usually expected as a script of someone who claims to be a cis heterosexual male. And of course, there are problems with this, no? And we'll talk about the problems later. Now, according to Connell, who coined these types of masculinity, is there are two basic stools where this chair of hegemonic masculinity or toxic masculinity is standing on. And this one is the first one is the domination of women and femininity. And basically, it tries to assert that, misogyny, sexism, that males are better than women, so sometimes to the point of devaluing women over men. And then also, expressing distaste or discrimination against femininity. So even if you identify as a straight man, if your gender expressions are feminine, if you're not courageous, if you express na hindi ako matapang, or hindi ako risk taker, hindi ako marunong mag-basketball, sometimes you're valued less of a man just because you do not practice this type of masculinity. Diba? If ikaw ay iyakin, diba? You are being ridiculed for that type of expression, no? And sometimes, to a point, psychologically, for men, this is kind of tasking as well, because there is a certain script that you have to follow as a man, as society wants to expect you, even though it's not part of any policy or rule that you have to be, athletic or a risk taker, but you have to follow it because that is what society is expecting you, so ayon. Next, also homophobia, because heterosexuality is something that's clearly connected with hegemonic masculinity. And also, they don't also like, trans and, genderqueer identities as well. But hegemonic masculinity doesn't only, push men to dominate women and, do not practice femininity, but also, dominate other men. So, the toxic environment of, you have to win, you have to achieve, right? You have to be successful, you have to, get ahead, right? So, and this is not only against women, but also other male counterparts. And also, the social practice of hegemonic or toxic masculinity is the reason we have the phrases, boys will be boys, they will roughhouse each other, they will manhandle each other, they will, magagasgasan sila, masasaktan sila, makikipagsapakan sila. And that was one of the expectations that my father had with me, parang, wag kang uuwi sa bahay nang umiiyak. No, ayokong maririnig ko na nakikipagbubugan ka, na pag inaya kang makipagbugbugan, tapos umiyak ka at tumakbo ka, huwag kang uuwi kasi lalo kitang paiiyakin. Yun ang sabi sa akin ng tatay ko at saka also some of the fathers of children of my age during my generation. Diba? Mas gugustuhin ko pa, sabi niya, na ikaw ay umuwi na nabugbog kahit may black eye ka, kahit bali-bali ang buto mo, basta ang alam ko, nakipaglaban ka, nakipag-away ka. Wow. So that, the example of pressures of, getting to that script, that performing hegemonic masculinity as a male child nung mga panahon na yon. And then of course, yung mga kalalaki mong tao, nakatikwas yung mga daliri mo. Kalalaki mong tao, sumisigaw ka pag nanonood ka ng horror. Kalalaki mong tao, pero hindi ka masyado kang mahiyain. Yung kalalaki mong tao in the Philippines, hindi ka marunong mag-basketball. Di ba ganon? So these are examples of how society, social groups, individuals do negative social sanction. Negative sanction on people who do not demonstrate hegemonic masculinity, especially for men. And also the reason why we don't, that's the reason why society doesn't like women who cry rape, women who say that no, I've been devalued by men, because in a patriarchal society that we have to excuse hegemonic masculinity, and therefore when women fight back, weird yon para sa society natin na patriarchal ang roots. Kaya madalas pinapatahimik, madalas kino-combat, diba? And therefore, movements like the Me Too movement are so important because it reclaims and it tries to debase, it's trying to fight against that narrative of hegemonic masculinity, both in the side of males who want to be aggressive and who want to devalue women, and for women who are trying to stand up against being devalued and dominated against. So what are negative effects of hegemonic or toxic masculinity when it's perpetuated by the culture in the different institutions? So number one, of course, we have in education, it encourages bullying, it encourages roughhousing against, and it feels like you are more manly if you are the bully, because aggression, because courage, because risk taking, right? And then in criminology, it is almost always that if you are a man, it's easy to profile men as suspects for crimes, because again, aggression, courage, risk taking, violence, aggression usually correlated sa men, so they're more likely to commit crimes. Next, in terms of health, is a lot of this is because, well, of course, one, risk-taking aggression, so they're more likely to get physical disabilities, physical injuries compared to females because of acting out toxic masculinity, but also in terms of psychological issues because of emotional restraint. And it's always important for psychological well-being for you to do catharsis, right? For you to be able to unleash your emotions, talk your emotions out. But since you're a man, you cannot do that because you're supposed to be strong. You're supposed to be getting that. And also, for men, they're less likely to go to the clinic or less likely to go to a health agency when they feel sick compared to females. That's the reason why there are more females who are more likely to get sickness compared to males, because females are more likely to visit the doctor compared to males, because again, toxic masculinity tells men that, that's just a disease, I can handle it, I am strong enough. So, yun ang mga issues ng hegemonic toxic masculinity in terms of health. In terms of organizations, syempre, leadership roles are more assigned to men compared to females. Although in the Philippines, we kinda are better than other countries. But still, may mga judgments again, parang there's a masculine way of doing leadership, risk-taking, and then for females, kasi ganyan siyang leader kasi babae kasi hindi siya risk-taker, hindi siya aggressive, hindi siya one-sided, pabago-bago isip kasi babae. So again, devaluing femininity is something that hegemonic masculinity is good at. Next, syempre sa sports, di ba? Because a lot of sports are combat intensive. They need a lot of physical strength. And physical strength, again, is something that hegemonic masculinity is pointing towards men. So, mas successful na lalaki sa sports kumpara sa mga babae. And of course, in the military. Like everything, even for females, yung mga ideas ng toxic masculinity ay binibigay sa military institutions, sa mga people who are in the military. And you don't have to be male to be able to see how toxic masculinity is rewarded. Like for example, sometimes females can be rewarded when they perform masculine roles. I don't know how many of you have gotten a compliment, quote unquote, from other guys saying, you know what, you're not like the other girls, and they say, you don't really think long about dressing up. You don't have to wear makeup. Hindi ka maarte. You play sports, and I like that. And when you look at romantic comedies, when you look at films, these are some of the females that we venerate. We venerate them because they're not like other girls. And going back again to hegemonic masculinity, devaluing femininity. So, like I said, you don't have to be male to be celebrating masculine roles. And sometimes females, kailangan maging aggressive din ako para, kailangan makipagsabayan ako sa mga lalaki, so dapat I should also be like them. Kasi nga, they feel like, even if they're females, they're going to gain something if they perform masculine roles. And sometimes, it is rewarded. Kaya, mas lalong ume-extend yung power ng toxic masculinity, hindi lang sa mga lalaki. And, though hegemonic and toxic masculinity caters a lot to straight and cis men, meron ding nakukuhang benefits ang non-heterosexuals from toxic masculinity, especially gay men who perform masculine roles. I don't know if any of you are gay in class, and of course I will not assume that, or I will not really pry on that, but there is a phenomenon within the Filipino gay community wherein when you are muscular, which is again, muscularity, strength is something that or borta, something that we attribute to toxic masculinity. When you're discreet, meaning you're straight passing, meaning hindi ka halata, hindi ka effeminate, you're usually more desirable compared to other quote-unquote types of gays who are more feminine. And at the same time also, when there's a gay couple, I'm looking at you, Vice Ganda, no? When there's a gay couple, there's always that question and assumption na, sino sa inyo lalaki? Sino sa inyo babae? When there's a lesbian couple, sino sa inyo yung lalaki? Sino sa inyo yung babae? And again, that appeals to heteronormativity, that appeals to toxic masculinity, because again, when you identify that some of them is a man, acting a man, then there's an argument that that guy is possessing all the traits that I've listed earlier. And kind of the dominant one in the relationship. Which again, doesn't always have to be the case. And they're arguing, no, dapat kahit you're a gay couple or a lesbian couple, there's someone should act like the wife, someone has to be the husband, so that it will work. So again, attempting to appeal to the narrative of heteronormativity and toxic masculinity, which again can be very harmful. So, yon. And then, I don't know if you know these terms, but in anal sex, that is performed by gay couples. Usually there's an act of topping, or the tops, and there are the bottoms. The tops are the ones who are anal insertive, so they're the ones who penetrate, and you have the bottoms, the ones who get penetrated into. And ganun din, parang yung act of being a top is more manly. So, ang expected nila kapag ikaw yung top in a relationship, then you are the one who's more manly. So they can take, how can you be top if you're effeminate? I'm not gonna trust a top like that. Or a bottom who's, actually, they celebrate bottoms who are manly. So again, pag nandun yung manly, mas nagiging desirable para sa kanila. So, that's an example of how toxic masculinity can penetrate outside men. It can also get into females and also non-heterosexuals. Now, Connell also identified 3 other types of masculinities that are not as powerful or as accepted as toxic or hegemonic masculinity. The first one is hybrid or complicit masculinity. And these people who have this type of masculinity, these men who have this, may not embody all the traits but are complicit to misogyny and patriarchy, or perform toxic masculinity in less obvious ways. Like for example, I love Big Bang Theory, but it's really problematic in terms of being having hybrid masculinity, because they do not possess all the traits. Like for example, they're not strong jocks, they're not aggressive, they're not violent, but they're very misogynistic against each other. They make jokes about Penny, the girl who is the main female character in the story. They always make her the sexual object. So sometimes these people who do not embody all the traits, it's either hindi sila masyadong aggressive, or hindi sila physically strong, hindi sila nagbabasketball, pero they still, objectify women. They still devalue femininity, diba? They are still embodying some points of masculinity. Meron lang silang konting areas kung saan sila marginalized, but they are still contributing to the harms caused by masculinity, such as rape culture and sexual objectification of females. Before I forget, objectification of women is also a social practice, and this being supported by patriarchy. Right? So, seeing women as, means to an end, as people who could be gaining pleasures from, these are forms of objectification, no? And also as making their natural body attributes as ways for commercialization. Like for example, yung feminine wash, diba? They see menstruation and vaginal acids as nuisance, and they make money out of it. So that's an example of how objectification works. Also, yung sexiness ng babae, kino-commercialize. Example of objectification. Another form of masculinity is marginalized masculinity, which is a form of masculinity which is unable to conform to or derive benefits from hegemonic masculinity. Marginalized masculinity might refer to lack of some characteristics of hegemonic masculinity, like having a disability or being non-white. So having a disability, they cannot, be strong. They cannot always be they can't always have the achievements as those who are able-bodied can. So baka hindi nila ma-reap yung benefits ng pagiging lalaki nila. And also, for example, being non-white. Like for example, I feel like yung sexual aggression ng white men in the States would more likely be tolerated compared to black males doing sexual aggression. So, not when you put extra intersectional identities, when you intersect other identities to being a man, nababawasan yung possible nilang benefits from masculinity from a patriarchal society. So, yun yung example natin. If you're a person of color, you're going to be less likely tolerated for sexual aggression in a white-dominated country. Or for example, di ba, for men who catcall, di ba, most likely parang natotolerate yung mga nagka-catcall na mestizo compared to those who are not so aesthetically pleasing, because there is a prevailing colorism in the Philippines, right? But of course, it doesn't make the one who is ugly not a toxic masculine person. I'm just saying that the benefits would be lesser for persons who are not, fair in our country. And then, we have what we call subordinate masculinity, and these are men who lacks many of the qualities of hegemonic masculinity while also expressing qualities opposite to hegemonic masculinity. For example, it may involve acting in a feminine way, no? These are men, for example, who get into the arts, into ballet, contemporary dance, and they most likely would have been subordinated and devalued for liking arts that are usually given to females. And this is one of the reasons why there is a lot of emotional conflicts in some men, because some men, they want to really pursue careers and arts that are usually catered for females, but they couldn't because they fear of being discriminated against. Diba? For example, it may involve acting in a feminine way and being overtly emotional or not being heterosexual or not being cis. I'm assuming that being a trans man, will basically also entail that person to have a subordinate masculinity. So in summary, we discussed about 4 gender frameworks of looking how gender is socially constructed in our society. So the first perspective looks at how gender is formed at an individual level. And this basically explains the biological and the psychological and developmental theories that are related to getting these gender-related behaviors and traits. Next, we discussed about the Structuralist Framework, which talks about, having these traditional gender norms actually have a function in society because of gender division of labor. Next, we had Interactionist Gender Framework, which basically says that gender is a role that we perform, it's a status that we have, and we all do and perform gender. And finally, we say that gender is an institution based on the institutionalist gender framework. And this institution is usually taken for granted. These are socially established practices, and these are usually unconsciously perpetuated and transmitted from generation to generation. And usually it is a manifestation of the underlying gender inequality in our society, which is supported by patriarchy, toxic masculinity, misogyny, and which also supports other abusive practices and other abusive narratives and discourses such as rape culture and female objectification, and of course heterosexism then.